Hello, everybody. We are going to spend a little time considering the background of our study, where we're going, the scriptures that we will be taking a look at. And we're calling the Lenten Discipleship Initiative 5324. Molly, you want to share with us how we arrived at 5324?
Yeah, sure. So we started out looking for outside resources, trying to find something that we really thought would fit the church at this time and place. But we weren't really finding anything that we were really excited about. But we were excited about the idea of creating our own curriculum and study. So we thought maybe because we've been going through Luke's parables in the sermon series for the past few months, that we should look at how Luke describes the passion and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So as we were looking at that, you said something along the lines of, this reminds me of that show 24. Now, if you don't remember 24, it was about this character Jack Bauer, and it was sort of him. Each season was 24 hours in his life as he's trying to avert various kinds of disaster.
Yeah. It was a great show.
Yeah. So we decided to call the study 24, looking at the last 24 hours of Jesus's life.
From Luke 22 and 23.
Exactly, yes. So then as we continued on with the study, we added the 53 in.
Yeah, as I said in a few weeks ago in a sermon, one of my seminary professors said context is king. And so when we began to consider Luke 22 and 23, we wanted to ask, well, what's the context? What was Luke trying to get across the way that he wrote those chapters at the end of his gospel? And you have to remember that gospel writers, they wanted to convey historical fact. That's what they did, the events that actually occurred. But they did it like a preacher would do it. They would arrange those historical events to try to create themes and ideas to convey to those who would read their works what the main point of it all is. And so we were really interested to try to figure out what is the compelling message that Luke was trying to get across, and how does 22 and 23 fit into that message?
Mm-hmm. So we were looking at, for example, Matthew. He sort of styles his gospel with Jesus as this new Moses. And there's this kind of return from exile theme that culminates in this new covenant that's created. And in a similar way, John sort of styles things as this new creation and ultimately, again, the new covenant. So we were looking at these kind of thematic themes, as Chris said, to try to figure out what these gospel writers were trying to communicate to their audience. Especially this sort of continuity between the Old Testament and the New, and God's purposes in the Old Testament and the New.
Yeah, and with Luke, you also have to take in consideration that Luke wrote the book of Acts, and they're very closely connected to each other. And so we were looking at the entire scope of Luke's writing, Luke Acts. And do you want to share what we found?
Yeah, so one of the main themes that we saw in Luke is the importance of prophetic fulfillment. And this starts way in the beginning of Luke, when it's explicitly said that Jesus's birth in the Annunciation to Mary that Gabriel does, and Mary's song, in Zechariah's song, and what Anna and Simeon say about Jesus, those are all really intimately connected with prophetic fulfillment from the Old Testament. And Luke ends his gospel the same way, by really driving home this message of prophetic fulfillment. So I'm just going to read from Luke 24, actually. Jesus says to his disciples after the resurrection, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" So Jesus is really explicitly saying, the prophets told you about me, and here I am.
Luke actually mentions prophets or prophecy 61 times. When you look at Mark, it's only 7 times, or John, only 14 times, where they specifically mention prophets or prophecy. So you can really see this emphasis on the issues of prophetic fulfillment. And then when we began to look at the prophecies that Luke lays out, we realize that Isaiah is central. He's like the main prophet that Luke mentions over and over. So the Annunciation to Mary, that's all based on Isaiah chapter 9, or John the Baptist, his ministry. That's a quote that comes directly out of Isaiah 40 when Luke is writing about John the Baptist. Or Jesus, really significantly important, is Jesus defines his ministry. He's in a synagogue, he sits down and he opens up Isaiah 61 and reads it and says, this is fulfilled in your presence right now, saying this is what I'm all about. You go on to the book of Acts. You have this long story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and the eunuch comes to faith because he's reading Isaiah 53. You go to the very end of the book of Acts, and the very last quote is an extensive quote of Isaiah 6. So it became significantly obvious or clear to us that Isaiah was a main focus for Luke.
Why do you think it was that Isaiah was so important to Luke?
Yeah, well, you got to remember who Luke was. Luke, he accompanied Paul in his missionary journeys. He, from city to city, he watched how Paul shared the gospel with the Gentiles. He ended up in Rome with Paul at the end of the book of Acts. And Luke was a first-hand witness of the gospel going from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to what was considered then the very ends of the earth. And out of all the books in the Old Testament, all the prophetic books, the one book that specifically talks about how the good news, it actually uses the word good news in Isaiah, how that good news would go out from Jerusalem to the very ends of the earth. And so that's why Luke, I think in particular, emphasized this aspect.
So as we were noticing this connection and how deep it went, we were looking through Luke 22, the story of the Last Supper, before Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And we noticed that Jesus directly quotes Isaiah 53 when he says that it is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. So just as Jesus in Luke 4 identifies his mission as that of Isaiah 61, here he is identifying his mission in the cross and what is to come as that of Isaiah 53. And that was just like a light bulb went off for us of seeing how Jesus explicitly is making this connection, that this climax of this prophetic fulfillment is from Isaiah 53, and it's going to happen in the cross.
Yeah, I mean, Isaiah 53 ends up being the linchpin of how the gospel would actually reach the world. And so as Luke begins to write and craft, when he gets to Luke 22 and 23, this last 24 hours of Jesus' life, he wants to drive home that this is what God had promised, that the Messiah would come and he would die, and from that point on, it would happen in Jerusalem, and from that point on, the gospel would then reach the very ends of the earth.
And one thing that's important is that Isaiah 53 has this really unique conception of the Messiah, right? He's not this triumphant, perfect figure who everything is easy for. He's a suffering servant. He's a suffering Messiah. And he's a servant for the people. And it's through him that the sins of the world are taken up. And the good news of salvation is opened up to the other nations, as you mentioned.
It really is. It's an arresting picture that Israel did not expect, and that's why there was so much hardship and quite a surprise about how Jesus fulfilled the prophetic statements in the Old Testament. I mean, he was a conqueror. He was victorious, but he did it as Isaiah 53 describes that it would actually happen. And so anyway, that's how we ended up with 53:24 as our theme for the Lenten Discipleship Initiative this time around.
So your small groups are going to be focusing mostly on Luke 22 and 23 as we look through the Passion narrative, the Last Supper, through the Crucifixion. And the sermon series will be bringing forth and explaining and proclaiming Isaiah 53.
And as we explore Luke 22 and 23 and Isaiah 53 throughout Lent, we really do hope that you find great encouragement and many applications to your life as you continue to walk and live